script, on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region, for we women and we children. That must be the ambition of the Caribbean and the Caribbean and the Caribbean. One race from the same place that make the same trip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region, for we women and we children. That must be the ambition of the Caribbean and the Caribbean and the Caribbean.
And welcome to today's edition of the Open Word Podcast, the voice and the sound of the Black Stallion in the background there with Caribbean Man. Of course, our country, Guyana, has played a pivotal role in the regional integration movement. And we continue, some of us, to believe that development in Guyana is tied to the wider development of the CARICOM region, but of course, the larger Caribbean community. And one person who has played an important role in that movement and continues to feel that given our recent oil find, that we can become that pivotal cog in the wheel of regional integration, and that Guyana's oil wealth should be used not just to deal with the likes of poverty in Guyana, but also in the wider Caribbean. We continue to believe in regional integration. Let me introduce Professor Clive Thomas. Professor, how are you today?
Fine, David, fine.
I reference our introductory theme song there, the Caribbean Man by the Black Stallion song.
Actually, yes.
Yes, in 1979. Yeah. And of course, you have always been a staunch proponent of regional integration, not just as a form of politics, but as a form of development. You were certainly part of the New World Group, along with your brother, colleague, academic, who just died. One of the first works on CARICOM was written by yourself and your brother who just passed away. And of course, you've been saying that our new oil find should not be seen just narrowly in terms of Guyana, but in terms of the larger Caribbean. Why you remain so convinced that Caribbean integration, despite all its ups and downs, you remain convinced that it's perhaps the most important path to economic development for our region?
For several reasons, David, and not only economic. It's part of the culture. Maybe the first job I ever had after I went to university was in Jamaica. So I always consider myself a regional person. I was working in the area of research at the Institute of Economic and Social Research at the Mona campus in Jamaica. So my first exposure to the region made me realize that this is a part of a culture that I belong to, even though I didn't grow up in Jamaica. I could feel an empathy, a simpatico that I couldn't feel anywhere else, although I lived a lot of the time before in Europe. So it's part of my culture, part of my also outlook and expectations. I also believe that when I was working that study in the early days with Brewster, that I discovered that we must have a necessary minimal platform if Guyana was going to do any development, or the region itself, any independent development. And that required scale, which is a very important factor in economics. So the necessary platform for development of whether it's agriculture, services, manufactures, exportation of selected products like oil and so on, highly specialized products, had to rest on the foundation of a platform of economic aggregates that were sufficient to ensure that we could be self-sustaining, that is, we could promote growth without an overly dependent reliance on its entirely on its exportation. The regional market for most of these things was small, but even smaller and far more infinitesimal were the individual country markets. You can't develop any scale. Without scale, you can't move into more or less what we might call modern production systems, where we're able to benefit from the economies of scale, which is a very important part of economics and part of business efficiency. So I've always seen the CARICOM region as a minimal platform from which we will advance. It also gives us a strong position in the global community because we bring together potentially 14, 15 votes, even more, because we might get some neighbors in the region to share with us. And we could push outwards, try to bring in, at that time, Haiti wasn't a significant part. We got Haiti now, but we could try to push out to widen the region so it became something more than just a collection of islands with an independent existence. I was further impressed also in I did a lot of our history. I didn't do any of it before I left the Caribbean. At Queen's College, I never did West Indian history. I learned nothing about the region. When I did a degree in economics and so on, I learned all about the history of other countries, other continents, but knew very little about the West Indies or the CARICOM region, or even the Caribbean region. So I spent a lot of time trying to learn a lot of that. And I began to become more and more aware that this is our cultural background. And to think outside of that would be a strategic mistake for us. And given the size and issues of size became
Mhm.
very important in the realities of what I felt we were going through in those days. Fighting for independence, fighting to develop sustaining economies, fighting not to be dominated by colonial overlords and that type of thing was a significant struggle. And we could only do it by taking advantage of the opportunities for increasing our size and influence. So that also played a part.
Mhm.
That in a
Mhm.
capsule is a pretty condensed vision of why I think that we can't ever separate ourselves from the rest of the region, or we should
Yeah.
never. It's also an ambition. It's not only an actuality, but it should be an ambition for us. And that respects our history too, because the history we've had is a history which treated us as a region.
Yes.
The planters and so on treated us as a region. The
Yeah.
governors treated us as a region. They didn't think we were separate islands unto itself. We were parts of an empire. So we had the advantage, I think, that we needed to persist and keep.
Yes, and I know, Professor, we didn't set out to talk about regional integration. We had another topic in mind, but I have to, since I have you here and you've gone off on this trajectory. I came in to politics in the 1970s as a young man, and came in with a sense of the Caribbean. I mean, we were talking about revolution in the 1970s. But that revolution you never felt was just native to Guyana, but was to the rest of the Caribbean, thanks to people like yourself and Walter and Maurice and Brother UC and so forth, who were well located in that Caribbean praxis. And I just want to say thanks for that, because I think my own understanding of Guyana has been enhanced whenever I locate in the broader Caribbean. And while we're on the question of CARICOM and social and economic development, I still use, as part of my reading list, whenever I teach Caribbean political economy, a piece that you wrote over 20 years ago, the achievements and non-achievements of CARICOM. You remember that piece?
No, I don't. I wrote some of the titles are so nice sounding, but I don't remember it particularly.
Yes, I still use it as part of my reading list. But as you look back on CARICOM, I know the Treaty of Chaguaramas was signed in 1973. This year is 50 years. But for you and your generation, regional integration would go as far back as the Federation. As you put your gaze on that 60 years of regional integration, what would you say has been our biggest achievements as a region during that period?
I think our biggest achievement is just the sense that we should be joined together. It's something that is intangible, but it's something that is very practical. I've dealt with people who are in all sorts of fields, and it's very easy to invoke among them a sense of family, of togetherness. And I think that will not go away. And I'm hoping that Guyana will use its resources and think of creative ways in which we could sort of create a spirit and an actuality in bringing that togetherness together. We used to be proud of many little things, everything like that is Caribbean, every Olympic achievement, every test match, everything. These were proud moments for us. And it shows what small countries could do with a strong sense of belonging. So I think that is the sort of the tapestry within which we have to build the future. And I don't want this generation to lose it. And I don't want Guyana in pursuit of the wealth that we talk about, or pursuit of if we were to use it successfully, the removal of poverty from Guyana, to do it in isolation from what we can do for the rest of the region. Because I see the oil resources as doing more than what Guyana needs. And I also think that the skills outside of Guyana are awesome. I've dealt with Caribbean people from every island, and I think they bring enormous talents. This is how I believe that in Guyana we have people with enormous talents. Guyanese with enormous talents all around the world. I found that, and I found Caribbean people are exceptional in that regard. I used to joke and say it's because we survived the transatlantic trade. That in the movement of peoples across the Atlantic and slavery, the fittest survived because our ancestors who survived really had to be exceptional. Because remember, as a slave on a ship had less space to live in while he was falling himself across the Caribbean or being transferred than a coffin. So you could imagine the rigors of having to survive that trip. And I can remember when I went to Dakar, Senegal, being taken to the dungeons where they used to keep the slaves before they shipped them. And I couldn't stop crying. And that had to be something elemental. It had to be part of the eternal existence of Caribbean peoples, of slaves. We came from an ancient civilization going back through time immemorial, probably the first humans on Earth. So that plays an important part in it. And I
Yeah.
would want to, and I also don't think that it is only a geological mystery that the oil we find in the Caribbean region or in Ghana is similar to the oil that we find in off the coast of West Africa. Because originally, when the earth was formed millions and millions of years ago, it was one continent called Pangaea, and that continent drifted apart. What we're finding on the west east coast of Ghana is what has been found already on the west coast of Africa. And that is what has given me a strong sense of fortitude and belief in that the oil finds will continue to be significant here. And I noticed the government, as I mentioned last week, in its advertisement for the forthcoming public auctions, have moved to declaring that we have 25 billion barrels of oil on offer. I can remember when I was estimating 11 to 13, people were laughing at me. And that has come and gone because even Exxon is saying that is now 11.3 plus billion after the last find of 1.3. Because prior to that, they were saying it was 10.
Yeah.
And I've redone my calculation recently, as you will see as we go through the series. I think the article might have been printed by now. I don't know. I don't think so. But that my recent estimate is 28 to 30 billion barrels of oil, which still slightly exceeds the government at 25. But their movement from stopping quoting Exxon all the time at 11 point, at 10 point something, because the 1.3 is only recently found, is a good sign
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
people becoming aware that we have more resources than we are admitting, or that Exxon is admitting. Because Exxon has a strategy and not wanted to declare the wealth of the region because they don't want to bring in competitors.
See why staying on the regional integration movement and Guyana's oil. We have had our challenges of insularity. Some would say that insularity itself comes with regionalism. As you look at regional movements across the world, they've had to deal with insularity. Um, do you think that if Guyana is to take a regional gaze with regard its oil wealth, you've already said that we should regionalize the natural resource fund,
But yeah,
and yes. You think if we were to take a regional gaze and we were to, for example, use our oil well to help to deal with the question of poverty across the region, do you think that that could help to decrease the level of insularity that we've seen from time to time?
yes, it can, because the other option that we have not talked about is this labor.
Uh-huh.
I still think that should be our priorities place for space for
Okay.
reporting people's, long migration. But we hear no discussion of this at all in the media.
Right.
I mean, although they had a recent meeting of the ILO, it hardly rises to the public prominence as they should. Do we have a skills-based policy that gives priority to the Caribbean? Of course, this will bring in all sorts of issues in terms of elections and the
Hmm.
competition for constituents. Um, so that is a complex issue, but that also is a very important way. And the capital from the region too, and the entrepreneurial skills, I would not underestimate, as I told you before. considerable. And I think that these are things that we should be seeking to offer Guyana as the
Right,
showplace
right.
for.
Mhm. But see why if you go back, and you would know this more than me, the when we had bauxite and gold and diamond, we had labor coming from the rest of the Caribbean and lots of migration into
Yeah, so
Guyana. Right, 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 right,
my neighbor up my street came from St. Lucia, a small farmer.
right. Yeah, 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 yeah. So let's talk about this whole question of capital within the context of the region, um, and how our oil industry could benefit from investments from the rest of the Caribbean. You've already mentioned that a lot of entrepreneurial skills are out there. Um, Flesh it out for us. How could our industry and our country benefit from the regionalization of the capital as far as investment in the industry is concerned?
I think first of all we got to create the atmosphere
Uh-huh.
that makes the rest of the region believe that we are the capital for finance. We are the leading center for finance and capital and innovation. They are sufficiently entrepreneurial and inventive and creative as to come and find us. So we just have to do the things to prepare ourselves. We don't have to overly beseech people to come here. I think, you know how many West Indian or Caribbean people have spoken to me about coming to Guyana. They want to know what's going on. They want to eat a piece of the pie, particularly when I was working in the government.
Hmm.
So I think we just have to advertise ourselves as a place. We have to show imagination. We have to show creativity. We have to show vision. We have to excite their imagination. And they can see this is the mecca or the center for all the things creative we want to do. We have to also show ambition. You can't just want to be Guyana in the background and doing the traditional things we do. We have to be very inventive, very creative. And once we open up the vision, they are entrepreneurs, they will gravitate towards us and they will give us feedback in the visions, and they will also be looking for finance to do some of these things. So I think a win-win situation for us.
Mhm. Is the Caribbean single market mechanism helpful in that regard? Do you think?
Well, it's a helpful in the sense that we have it, so we should use it. But we have always felt that the single market and economy is more a vision that has not been realized than an actuality.
Hmm.
Because we don't recognize that governments are still particularly nationalistic and they play for the particular island that they're living. They're responsible for the particular island or territory that they are responsible for or they are that have elected them. And therefore they try to impose restrictions and defeat the purpose and the aims of single market and economy once it redounds apparently to the disadvantage of their citizens. So we have to get a working mentality that makes sure that the gains are seen, not as gains that are particular to one economy, but to the collective region. And that requires statesmanship and requires the vision being shared by these other leaders. So I think a lot of it has to do with how we communicate, how we deal with each other. Some of the governments exhibit significant leadership skills. Barbados is one example.
Hmm. Yeah.
And at the global level, I think their political leadership shows exceptional skills. But that is running in isolation from the rest of us. There's very little interaction or complementarity with what is happening in the Western region. Almost some jealousy.
Mm-hmm. Now, in this regard, our emphasis or apparent overemphasis on local content, could that be something that could frustrate the regionalization of our thrust?
No, I think it's how we interpret it.
Okay,
We should integrate it into the CARICOM regime so that local is defined as Guyana and CARICOM.
there you go. There you go.
Simple solution.
There you go. There you go. Do you think that we have the kind of we have the kind of insight here in Guyana that could move in that direction of making the local regional?
Well, you see, there's a big problem. To many people, they call for local. To many of our trading class or merchant class, the call for local is a call for protection. They don't want to say, give me protection so I could make money on this side and don't tell you how much and then don't pay taxes. They're trying to ride the nationalist bandwagon. They want local content, but local content is disguised protection. And that is what we have to avoid. So we have to have skillful governments. They have to understand that, I shouldn't say skillful governments, I mean, that may be not enough. But governments that are not dependent on having that trader class as their natural ally.
Mm-hmm.
Because that is what drives their linkage to them. They're their allies in every single thing, every single political move, every single cultural manifestation. Look at how they feel with each other, who are the closest buddies.
Mm-hmm.
So to them, local content is disguised protection. I get in the state to protect me, and I say that I'm doing this on behalf of the nation. When they don't care to who's in the nation, they're just ripping off the money for themselves.
Ripping off the money for themselves. And see why, as we go out, I want to introduce a subject which we are going to develop in the next episode. And that is the subject of the contract. Because even as we talk about a regional gaze, entrepreneurs and other policymakers in the region would be looking at the politics of oil here in Guyana. And you just mentioned that entrepreneurial class, the local entrepreneurial class, what they interpret local content to mean. But there's been a lot of talk about the oil contract, and in some sense, everything about oil has become about the oil contract. Is there too much about not much,
Well,
or is it justified?
I, there's no contract that is perfect.
Uh-huh.
That's number one. So there's what is called a theory of incomplete contracts. All contracts have to be modified as they go forward, as they discover the weaknesses and the strains and the difficulties of them. So there's no perfect PSA. I try to report on the actual evaluations of them that have been done by institutions and individuals with credence. There's several of them that have been done. I think probably the most important that have been done by the World Bank, by the IDB, by Open Oil, by the University of Trinidad and Tobago, by two specialist firms that are engaged in oil intelligence work, Rystad Energy and Bunbukenzi. And these have been published. And I have been kept reporting on the results from time to time because statements are made that are totally inaccurate. And I don't like to get engaged in pointing out to other writers what mistakes they're making. I don't do that as a rule. But I try from time to time to give people details on what it is and allow them to form their own point of view. So there's a lot of mis and disinformation. It pervades what is happening. And sometimes you believe that what is happening in the US that I find almost inexplicable. How people could still be believing a core of people that Biden stole the elections from Trump and it's continuing. The core of people that believe in a certain view of the contract in the face of the most strong arguments to the contrary. But people don't follow up. People don't. I see in the papers recently, and some of these people, my colleagues, I don't want to write in them, and I don't want to complain and embarrass them. But they would give exhibitions of how they arrive at what they're doing, and leave out the most elementary thing. How could you write on the distribution of revenue for a contract? From a contract and only include who's paying the cost for the production. But people are doing that.
Mm-hmm.
They assume that the cost is being paid by some mythical spirit from heaven. And when you appropriate the cost and against the people who are supposedly getting all the benefit, you see an entirely different situation. Because the oil doesn't come free. The oil has to be produced. It costs to produce. So you have to deduct the cost before you begin to start talking. So gross revenue and net revenue are two very different things. You also have a situation where in the industry, where the cost of production varies over the life cycle of the well. So in the early days, let's say, of production, we have a lot of startup problems we had in Guyana. Costs may be high. And then in the later stages, very late stages, when you're abandoning the wells, costs are also high because they got to protect the environment. But in that sweet spot between the two periods, they begin to reap all the economies of scale and costs flatten out. But you can't use those costs as the only cost. You have to take the costs over the cycle of the well. And they don't do that, and they just say what the figure allows in as a for taxation, as the ruling cost. So we have a lot of that basic confusion, and the experts in the papers know. They're very amazing.
And we are going to expand on some of those in our next edition. We just wanted to introduce the subject at the end of this edition, where we spent most of our time talking about the region and how it situates our oil wealth and our oil industry in a regional framework. Professor Clive Thomas, thank you again for coming through for another edition of the Open Word and Guyana's Oil. Any closing remarks before we go?
Well, till next week, we continue.
Yes, so we continue next week.
I'm enjoying the opportunity to pass on a little bit of information from time to time. I get good feedback.
Yes, and I've been getting a lot of good feedback. We continue to, the viewership increases, especially once the live feed is over and the podcast is there. A lot of people are taking advantage of the series that we're doing. So thanks again for coming.
Don't mention it. Okay. Bye, David.
Professor Clive Thomas there, of course. Today we dealt with regionalization, looking at Guyana's oil within a regional context, and that is always important. And one thing I took away from today, turning the local into the regional, or synthesizing the local and the regional, I think it's a way to go. I continue to believe as Professor Clive Thomas, that, our development in Guyana cannot be done as an island, certainly not as Guyana. And the larger Caribbean, the larger CARICOM region is very, very, very important. Next week, as we said, we're going to explore the contract, because a lot has been said about contract. And sometimes when you have a lot of conversation, it helps knowledge. But we know sometimes a lot of conversation really does not translate into knowledge. We're going to get Thomas to talk about the contract next week. Until then, I want to thank you all for tuning into yet another edition of the Open Word podcast. And of course, please go to our YouTube channel and subscribe to it so that you can be alerted when the Open Word is being broadcast. See you next week.
One race from the same place that make the same trip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region, for we women and we children. That must be the ambition of the Caribbean.